July of 1991 is when Austin took the fast out of the recession of the late 80s and started the decline that we've been on ever since. And I actually moved there in July of 91. Now, I'm not taking any credit for that, but all I have ever seen in my 30 years here is this boomtown of growth around technology. So when I took this job with the Austin Technology Council, I was in another city and I was visiting with the tech council that's there. And that particular tech council is one of these cities that's starting to get a lot of attention for their technology community, for their ecosystem that they're growing. And their technology council has 18 people on staff and an annual budget of like $7 million. And I said to the CEO of the tech council, how can your city, no offense to their city, how can you have this strong, vibrant, tight community around that, whereas I'm the only employee at the Austin Technology Council, and we have a lot of different groups, but we don't have that unity going forward that this particular city did. And they said, look, when you're trying to grow something, everyone gets behind you. But when you've sort of reached the pinnacle, people think, well, we don't have to support the community. Now, I actually believe that Austinites still support Austin, and I believe that our best days for our tech ecosystem are far, far ahead of us. I don't think that we have built a tech ecosystem. I think we are building a tech ecosystem. But the person who I was speaking to in this other city said that Austin needs to do a better job of educating everybody of where you came from. He said because if you talk to people in Austin, they don't know the history of how Austin got started. And so he said, when you get back, go and talk to people under 40 years old and ask them about the history of Austin and see how many people know the whole story. So I talked to 100 people over the course of the next 6 months, and only about 5 or 6 people had a real grasp on where Austin came from. So I created the talk I'm going to do for you today called The History of Austin Tech. Can I see a show of hands of how many of you really believe you understand the whole history? You know exactly what happened. There's 2 hands in the room, little half hand back there. I always like the people who are like, maybe. So I'm going to say some things today that are observational for me. You might say, oh, I viewed it a little bit differently. There may be some things you never heard before. And more importantly, I'm going to not say things that you think are really important. I just haven't heard of them yet, or I only have 25 minutes. I can't put everything into that talk. So please, afterwards, I would love to get your feedback. You can reach me at Thom, Thom, at austintechnologycouncil.org. If you have ideas on how to make this speech better, I am always open to it because I am not the expert on the history of Austin Tech, but I'm the one who will talk about it anytime I can because I think it's important that we understand. So I believe that you can trace back the history of Austin Tech and really that growth, not just to 1991, but I think you can trace it back to the summer of 1966. And in 1966, that was when the University of Texas at Austin's business school, now called McCombs, but back then it was called the UT Business School, hired Dr. George Kosmetsky to be the dean of the school with the intent of growing and reinventing that business school. Now, what's interesting is I have friends in Pittsburgh, and they've told me an interesting fact, is that year in 1966, Carnegie Mellon University tried to hire Dr. Kosmetsky to run and grow their business school. Because before he had gone off and been an entrepreneur and founded a company and took it public, Teledyne out in California, he had been a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. And he was really forward thinking. They wanted him back to reinvent that business school. And the people at the Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce and the Pittsburgh Tech Council will tell you if he had picked Carnegie Mellon, both of our cities would look very different because the things that he put into place in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s were the foundation that we all get to live in today and thrive upon. So if you go back to the 60s, you have the hiring of Dr. Kosmetsky, but you also have IBM is here, Texas Instruments is here, Motorola is here. You have the semiconductor companies sort of popping up in the late 60s and early 70s with everything that they're doing. You move on then to the 80s and you see MCC picks Austin as their headquarters. Sematech picks Austin as its headquarters. Dell Computer is founded. And you start seeing things like that as you get to the late 80s and 90s. Dell Computer, Trilogy, Tivoli, and several other companies have real massive growth, which spins off a lot of wealth to a lot of their employees, which allows those employees to then become entrepreneurs themselves, or they become
No, go ahead. Or they become investors. So you have a lot of things that are happening there. In the late 80s, early 90s, you also start to see things happening like the Austin Technology Incubator is founded. The Austin Technology Council is founded. Both of those, again, being founded by Dr. George Kosmetsky. You start, IC Squared pops up in the late 80s and starts to do things. You start to see Austin getting on the map and getting recognized. Simultaneously, in the 90s, tech starts to bubble up everywhere. If you remember in 97, Netscape goes public and everybody suddenly knows what the internet is and what a browser is, and all of our lives start to change in the mid 90s. That change across the globe really impacts Austin because we already have that foundation of being a tech center, and there's already things happening. So we have all of those things happening at the same time. In the 90s, South by Southwest Interactive, which had already been around, starts to explode and gets the world's attention of technology right here in Austin every spring. The most interesting thing about South by Southwest is it's always the second week of March, which the second week of March, Austin, Texas has better weather for a 10-day window than San Diego, California. So the whole world comes to Austin and walks around and goes, "This is awesome, I'm moving here." And then they arrive in August and September and say, "What have I done?" So all of those things start to happen. Then you also have in the 2000s, you have more growth of Austin really becoming that hotspot of things happening. In the 2010s, you have, and around the 2000s, you have an explosion of more investment capital. You have in the 90s all of the law firms and the banks and the accounting firms and other consultancies who work with startups and tech companies come and open offices in Austin. You start to see it's the formation of Capital Factory happens in about 2005. Lots of things starts to happen in that. In 2010s, you have the Googles, the Facebook, and other large companies decide that Austin is a great place to open up an office. So again, more attention comes into Austin. And then in the 2020s, all of a sudden, or also in the 2010s, you have more local companies like WP Engine, Indeed, etc., who start to grow and really get established, bringing more attention to Austin. And in the 2020s, you start to see more large tech companies opening here, and a phenomena that is not slowing down, and that is California and New York companies especially, but also Boston, Chicago, and other places, moving their headquarters to Austin, to Dallas, to Houston, and San Antonio. So the idea of a city being a technology hub that we have benefited for 30 years. In fact, for 30 years, Austin was the scrappy alternative to New York, to the Silicon Valley, to Los Angeles, etc. But now in the 2020s, you start to see the idea of a tech hub and cities competing against each other starting to change. And what's happening is Texas is becoming what they call the Texas Technology Triangle. With the growth that's happening in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio and College Station, things are happening within 200 miles of us that are going to change the dynamic of our entire area. And we as Austin need to step up and lead, not to dominate, but to stand shoulder to shoulder moving forward next to Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and some of these other cities who are growing their own tech ecosystems. Because the surveys show that as more companies move here, and as more companies are started and fostered here, within 20 years, the impact on the GDP is going to be as big as the Silicon Valley of what's going to happen in that 300-mile triangle that they're calling the Texas Technology Triangle. So all sorts of things are happening, but these headquarters are moving here. You've got Oracle, you've got Tesla. When I talk to Opportunity Austin, they have a pipeline of companies who are looking at moving their headquarters here or opening a second headquarters here. So all of a sudden, we are at this pinnacle where the whole world is paying attention to who we are. But there's something special about Austin. I have said for many years that Austinites have an unnatural love affair with Austin. And if we can keep that alive, if we can keep the people in tech to realize that it's not just our city versus other cities, or this area versus that area, or this company versus that company, but if we can pull together and really look at what can we do as a society, as a community, what can individuals do to really grow, the future of Austin is going to be like nothing that's ever told. I already think that our tech ecosystem, I think it is one of the greatest stories ever told in business. The founding of the organization that I work for was 32 years ago. It was founded as the Austin Software Council. It quickly became the Austin Technology Council, and it was founded for several reasons. My favorite reason, when you look back at the original sort of work around founding the Austin Software Council and turning it to the Austin Technology Council, was we were founded, I want you to think about this, to put technology on the map as a possible economic driver of our region. Check. I don't think anybody doesn't know that technology is the economic driver of our region. But so many things have happened that have made this happen. But also, being in Texas, the last 30 years isn't where entrepreneurship started. Texas has always been a place that has championed the person who leaves it all behind, comes here and starts. If you go back to the days of the Alamo, people left where they were and they came to Texas and planted their flag. If you go forward to the early 1900s, Howard Hughes and the Wildcatters. I worked for a law firm many years ago whose one of their claims to fame was they incorporated Howard Hughes as a wildcatter in his oil business back in the early 1900s. Texas has always been the place where we have championed people who want to create great things. But I want you to know that this didn't happen by accident. So I have interviewed dozens and dozens of people. I've talked to hundreds more about their experience in Austin and what they've seen around tech. And what I've realized is that there are 10 pillars that made Austin the awesome city of opportunity that we are today. 10 things happened. Now, the mayor had me speak to 300 people who were here for South by Southwest from all over the country last March. And afterwards, people who were running cities from Europe to South America to Asia were coming to me saying, I need the recipe book that you just gave. This was not a recipe book. This was not a plan. This is a retrospective of 10 things that came together that really made Austin great. So number one, I already mentioned, was the University of Texas and the hiring of Dr. George Kosmetsky. Without those things happening, you may not have the foundation that we have. Without UT founding the Austin Technology Incubator, which, by the way, from my understanding, is the oldest continuously run technology incubator in the country or maybe in the world. Yes? Great. Becky says, whatever, that sounds about right. So the University of Texas, in addition to that, also spun out a lot of opportunity. Now, a lot of people, when they think about the history of Austin Tech, and one of the questions I ask people when I talk to them is, who was the first company to go public in Austin in technology? And 100% of the people I've talked to, if they are under 50 years old, say what? Dell Computer. But it wasn't Dell Computer. It was actually Tracor. Tracor went public in 1976, and they were a spin-out of technology developed at the University of Texas. So again, all of these things come into play. When you look at the bringing of MCC here on the Austin Technology Council podcast, I interviewed Admiral Bobby Inman a few weeks ago, and he was responsible for helping choose Austin as the site where the semiconductor conglomerate of MCC, where they would come back in the late 80s. And he said that it never would have happened. They started with dozens of cities who wanted MCC to be based there if it hadn't been for the engineering school at UT, because the chamber and the mayor's office brought the then dean of the School of Engineering to the meeting, and he talked about everything that UT would do to help the semiconductor business, and no other city made a presentation like that. If you fast forward today, every time we do a relocation, every city brings their university and their business and their, all types of people. But back then, we were the first city really to make a pitch, bringing everybody to the table to show what we could do. So that first pillar is UT and Dr. Kosmetsky and everything that they touched in the early days to get things going. The second pillar is our central location in the United States. We're somewhat easy to get to. If you're in Seattle and you have to go to Miami, I think that's like a 47-hour flight. I actually was in Miami one time when a friend's mother died, and I wanted to go to the funeral in Los Angeles. And the flight, it was like a 7-hour, 6.5-hour flight. And I thought, what if you're going to Seattle? You'd just be on the plane forever. Being located in the middle. Now, originally, if you go back to the 90s, you had to change planes, right? You couldn't die and go to heaven from Austin without changing planes in Dallas back in the early 90s. But that's different now. With so many different airlines, the growth of our airport, they're going to double the size of the airport. We have direct flights to many places. So that central location in the country, even with the plane change, made it well. And within that same pillar, it's the great weather that we have in Austin. I used to work at the Chamber of Commerce 30 years ago, and they used to tell people when they look at Austin that, you know what? You can play golf in Austin 10 months out of the year. But what we're not telling you is the 2 months you can't play, because every other city you can't play in January, February, because it's cold. You can't play in August and early September here. But the rest of the time, Our weather is pretty good. If you take our spring and our fall, it's as good as any place out there. So that second pillar was really appealing to people. The third pillar was affordability. If you moved here in the 90s, you could buy one heck of a nice house on a golf course for under $400,000 to $500,000. Now those same houses are more expensive. You used to be able to rent an apartment for more than 50% the cost of renting an apartment. I moved here from San Jose, California in 91, and our rent for the same apartment was more than 50% less than we were paying in the Bay Area. So the affordability was really attractive to people who wanted to move here, who were young families who wanted to buy a home. I'm going to argue that the affordability pillar, if it's not gone, it is no longer a really strong pillar that's holding up our roof, and it probably won't come back. I don't think that genie can go back in the bottle. However, when you have 10 solid pillars that created this infrastructure, this ecosystem that we have, the great thing is you can have a couple of pillars go away and you still have a strong support system. And I argue we're going to create some new pillars that aren't even on the list yet as we move forward. So that affordability pillar was really important because people could come, they felt good about that. The fourth pillar was a really networked and connected town. People in tech in Austin, even if they were successful and had an exit or whatever, were willing to show up. You didn't have to put them on a panel. You didn't have to get them an award. They would show up and they would sit in the room when there was an event that supported tech. They say of Dr. George Kosmetsky, as busy as he was, because in addition to all the things he did in Austin, he sat on national boards for academia. He sat on research things that were created by President Nixon, Ford, and Reagan. With as busy as he was, if you had something that supported the Austin business scene, he was there. In his book, which is called A Civic-Minded Entrepreneur, that was the line that stood out to me the most. That if you needed him, he was there. We need to start seeing that again. We need to start seeing our leaders in the community saying, of course I will show up at the Digital 360 Summit. Of course I will show up at the C-Suite Summit that's being put on by the Austin Technology Council. Of course we will mentor at the Austin Technology Incubator, etc. We need to get back to that idea of being that networked community. Now we're still better than a lot of other cities. If you go to some of these other cities and you try to make connections, you're 5, 6 away and people will never return your call. In Austin, you're now about 3 people away. But we used to be 2 people away and everybody took your call. And while that ship also may have sailed, we can keep it a little bit more. We have to remember that Austin's secret weapon was the people and how connected they were and how willing they were and are to serve each other for the good of rising this ecosystem. The next pillar was a robust business economy that supported small, medium, and large companies. From a startup with an idea through Dell Computer, we have always embraced the companies. We have had such an amazing startup scene the last 15 years that, with the exception of just a couple of places, it's like nothing else that's gone on. We also have seen homegrown and moving of these giant companies here, but our specialness that we're not paying attention to, in my opinion, is the small to mid-sized growth-oriented companies. This is where our next unicorns come from. And the way I describe it at the Austin Technology Council is we want to be there for the startups. We want the participation of the big companies, but it's those companies who have 10 employees to about 400 employees that is where the future of Austin lies. And I read a book called Building the Fort that's about building a tech ecosystem. And we are way beyond what this book was teaching. But one of the things it said was if you are in a tech center and you are not the entrepreneur or in the C-suite of a tech company, your role is to make sure in some way you're supporting the growth of those small to mid-sized companies, because that's where your next Dell, your next Indeed, your next WP Engine, etc., that's where they come from. Startups are awesome, and we need them to continue to feed it, but we need to be paying attention to that middle. But as a city, we've done a really good job of not just being a startup town, not just being a big city town, not just being a mid-sized town. We have embraced all sizes throughout the history of this growth, and I think that is really, really important. And through that, we have had organizations and groups that have supported all levels of business, from the Chamber of Commerce to ATC to ATI to Austin Women in Technology to Capital Factory, etc. We have had so many groups that have chipped in and really found their way to support their area of Austin Tech. The next pillar is arts, music, and the Keep Austin Weird vibe. This is another pillar I think that's a little bit in trouble, right? Our musicians and artists can't afford to live in Austin like they used to. So the amount that are moving here from all over the country, they're going other places. They're finding other places where they can rent an apartment for $400 and not $3,000. And the Keep Austin Weird vibe, while it's still in our soul, when you have a Starbucks on every corner, I argue you're not that weird. But that's okay. As long as we can keep that vibe in our soul, we don't have to be outwardly that weird. We just have to remember our roots. And I think that's what's really important. So we have to embrace that weirdness wherever we find it. The next pillar was a young workforce. When I moved here in 1991, I read a stat that said the average age of an Austinite was around 30 years old. Fast forward 33 years, and a tripling of our population, and the average age of an Austinite is about 30 years old. So between the University of Texas, St. Ed's, Concordia, Houston-Tillotson, from our ACC, from our great universities that are here, but also to the fact that we're really attractive for young people to find this as a place to come and plant roots, that gives us an advantage to a lot of places because the ideas and the growth and the future are always coming out of that next generation. As I get older, my hair turns a little gray. It's a little harder to say, but our future isn't with me. I can still contribute. We can all still play, but our future is in that next generation. And we have to make sure that Austin stays attractive to people who are 30 years old and under, to find a place to set those roots and to get that connection to Austin where, going back to what I said, Austinites feel that unnatural love affair with Austin. We need to make sure that that next generation that comes here keeps a hold of that. The next thing is that we had investors and the VCs and the angels and the service providers that came and the incubators that are here. If it wasn't for all of that starting to really percolate up in the early 2000s and really reach a critical mass, it would be really hard for us to continue to feed that bear so that it can keep eating and growing and churning and doing it. But it happened. In the 90s, the 4 biggest California tech law firms came and opened offices here, and the accounting firms followed. And then you saw the technology banks like Silicon Valley Bank and Imperial Bank then, which became Comerica. They all came and put people in town, and they moved people from areas where tech was thriving so that we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel. We had consultants and investors who knew how to do tech and what was happening, and it came at a time where it wasn't going anywhere else around the country. It existed in the Valley and a couple of big cities, but Austin was that only place where those things started to come into the 90s. The next pillar is we have a pretty friendly business climate in the state of Texas and in the city of Austin. The city of Austin's had a little bit of ups and downs in how pro-business it's been, but overall, Austin has found a way to make room for tax abatements and growth and permits and things that needed to be done for all of this to happen. So again, having that pro-business state and the city that was willing to accommodate that has allowed us to have that. And then finally, the 10th pillar was South by Southwest. I really think that the timing of it was serendipitous, but if you look back to the late 1990s and the early 2000s, and especially up towards 2010, 11, 12, where South by Southwest became a phenomena around the world of tech. Everybody wanted to come here, and other cities were calling Hugh Forrest and others and saying, hey, why don't you're getting too big for Austin. Why don't you do South by Southwest in Las Vegas? Why don't you do South by South in San Antonio or the other really big convention towns? And South by took a stance many, many years ago, 2 decades ago, that their soul was in Austin and they weren't going to host it anywhere else. They might try other places. They have South by Southwest Sydney. They've tried in Portland, but their home, their heart is here, and that has allowed so many things to happen here. So many companies back in the early 2000s and early 2010s were launched at South by. People wanted to see what the new technologies were, and that really, really made a difference. Some of you may not know that after South by in 2025, we're bulldozing the entire convention center and rebuilding it, and it's going to be offline for 4 years. That is going to be a huge issue, and South by has said we're keeping ourselves in Austin. They're working with the hotels, they're working with the meeting spaces that exist everywhere else, but again, South by has said South by is here Because if they were to go to Nashville or they were to go to Las Vegas, that would take away one of those pillars that really supports us. So I think we need to realize, while some of us stay away from downtown during that time, we have to realize that that is one of the pillars that really allowed Austin to have the status that we do. But here's the thing. As I said before, we benefited from the idea of being this alternative tech hub. But if you travel the country now and you ask people, who are the big players? Who are the cities? It's the Silicon Valley, it's Los Angeles, it's New York, often Boston, and Austin. The rest of the country doesn't see us as a scrappy alternative. They see us as one of the players. But every city I talk to says they're a tech hub. I won't say which city, but some random city you've all heard of, but you would never think technology. There, 3 people I met at South by Southwest had shirts that said, this particular city is a tech hub. And I thought, if that's a tech hub, everybody's a tech hub. And if everybody's a tech hub, how do we look at it differently going forward? Austin is an innovation center, and that's what we need to look at. When you go to the Silicon Valley and you ask young entrepreneurs and young people who aren't even in tech or people of any age about the history of the Silicon Valley, they can tell you about the founding of Fairchild Semiconductor. They can tell you about Hewlett-Packard in their garage. They know the history. They know how it got there. They understand. In Austin, we don't know the history necessarily that got us here. And if we don't know our history, we cannot build upon it. So I think it's imperative as a community that we embrace where Austin has come from. And we realize that how we compete in the next 3 decades is entirely different on how we competed in the last 3 decades. And we have to position ourselves as this innovation center who's thinking deeply about the technology that's being created here and how it's changing the world. The motto of the University of Texas at Austin is, well, before I tell you that, I think we should all steal it. It's a copyrighted motto. We cannot steal it. But I think we should steal the vibe. The motto of the University of Texas at Austin is, what starts here changes the world. And I don't think that is limited to the 40 acres. I think that is Austin, that is in Austin's soul. And I think all of us, instead of looking at how much funding did somebody get, how many exits has she had, or how many VCs have opened offices here, I think when people ask us about Austin, we need to know and we need to care about the technology that's being created here and how it's going to change the world. Because every city out there is calling themselves what? An AI town. There isn't a city out there who's not saying we're an AI center. There are AI conferences happening in every city that has more than 10,000 people in it, I think, 50,000 people in it. However, are you aware that going back to the 90s, maybe even the 80s, a lot, not all, but a lot of the research that was done by IBM on their Watson was done here at the IBM Center here in Austin, which means going back 3 decades, Austin was an AI town before any city could claim they were an AI town. So as we look to the future, we have to realize that what has happened in the 50 to 100 miles around Austin is changing the world and has changed the world, and we need to embrace it as we go forward. I will tell you, it's been quite a journey the last 2 years running the Austin Technology Council. We have changed ATC, we've stripped it down to the walls, we're regrowing it, but I don't think there was a better time to be in the role that I'm in than right now, because I think the future of Austin is so bright, but it's all predicated on the history of Austin and what got us here. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to talk at lunch today. Thank you so much.